Based in Larkspur, California, Stephen A. Nielsen is a U.S. registered patent attorney with many years of experience in patent procurement and in achieving favorable results in federal court in the field of intellectual property litigation. Mr. Nielsen is the past chairperson of the intellectual property section of the Marin County Bar Association. Mr. Nielsen received his JD in 1987 from Bolt Hall, University of California at Berkeley, and also holds a BA in computer science. He may be contacted at steve@nielsenpatents.com, on his website, nielsenpatents.com, or via his LinkedIn page.
Good afternoon. I'm Steve Nielsen. I'm a registered patent attorney out of Marin, California, and we're here today to talk about diversity, inclusion, and bias in the legal profession. And I wanted to start out by acknowledging the reality of the CLE system in general, and that why are we here today? Arguably, we're here because we have to be. We have a So the relevance is that I have no illusions of grandeur or extra expertise or popularity in these presentations, but I do my very best to study the material available about it, synthesize it, and provide some sort of analysis. I think we'll recall that in law school, if one just recites the known data, you get an F. So what I try to do is add my own thoughts to it, try to put things together in a way that maybe hasn't been put together before. So we're all here today to meet our state bar requirements for diversity units, or perhaps engage your general interest in the subject. And I hope that some of you are here because you have a sincere interest, because it is a very interesting subject on a lot of levels and in a lot of depths. So let's get white big elephant out of the bag. What are my qualifications to present this event? There's been a lot of ink spilled about how some people are tired of seeing a bunch of older white guys on MCLE panels or part of diversity panels. And the best I can say on that is I had a law school professor who published books on fly fishing. And was he an expert fly fisher? Was he a fish himself? No, but he studied the material and wrote excellent books on fly fishing. Also, I don't feel that I have to limit myself because of the bag of bones that I carry around as my external me. So anyway, I wanted to get that off the table and acknowledge that that's just the reality. So I've never seen a presentation on, quote, diversity and inclusion. There's very few out there. So the good news is that we get to make our own experience here and put this together in hopefully a way that you haven't seen before. And what's interesting to me is as we get older, we have fewer and fewer new experiences. So every time we have a new experience, it becomes exciting, sort of like a young child. Every day is new and they have this excitement. So this is a great opportunity for us to learn some new things. And also we're not confined by a state bar mandated subject script or a set script of certain elements that we have to cover. And also, as far as the source of the lecture, in the substance abuse tapes that I've heard or videos that I've watched or live seminars that I've gone to, there's often some guy or gal who had their own downward spiral with alcoholism or drug abuse, and they talk about it from a personal level. And I've seen those, and they are moving, but also it's somewhat limited because you're just getting a person's personal experience. You aren't getting a preview or an analysis of all the available literature out there. So what I'm trying to do here is I've studied all the available literature that I get my hands on and provided my own viewpoint of it without a whole lot of personal experience or personal bias, if we can excuse the term today. So what are the required elements for our presentation today? They vary by state, and as of this taping here in 2018, only New York State and the state of Illinois have mandated diversity subjects. So later in this presentation, we'll talk about their particular elements. And I imagine after this taping, other states may adapt diversity requirements as well. But for today, it's a pretty new subject. Just 2 states recently adding this required subject to their list of required CLE. So what does the current literature tell us about diversity in the law, diversity in our society, and what are the conventional answers? Well, from the material that I read, this one kind of stuck out to me. There's a book called Diversity in Practice. It's published by the Cambridge Studies in Law. It's published in 2016. And the summary or the abstract states, Diversity in Practice, the book we're talking about, analyzes the disconnect between express commitments to diversity and practical achievements, revealing the often obscure systemic causes that drive persistent professional inequalities. Obscure systemic causes. I don't buy that. That just seems too vague, and I'm going to just come out of the box and get on a limb thinking not all the literature on the subject makes sense to me. I just don't believe in a conspiracy theory that we're that organized, that a group of people are that organized to sort of persist in a system of inequality. It's possible. I just don't buy these conspiracy theories. So what I suggest is that we look for some broader pictures here and that we weed out the junk science. That's going to be the theme of our approach today. So I'm going to talk about a lot of the approaches in the current literature and offer my own analysis of why I think they may or may not make sense. But this statement that there's some obscure systemic causes that drive persistent professional inequalities, that just sounds too hokey to me. But it's published in a book out of the Cambridge Studies of Law, so I guess it's worth talking about. And maybe you can go look at that book and draw your own conclusions. But again, this issue has been written about for decades. And I just don't think it's that simple or anything that sinister here. But we'll go through and figure this out. So what does the current literature tell us? First generational lawyers have challenges. Now, to me, this makes sense. I recall in law school seeing people who were the first in their family to go to college and to go to law school, and I could see some disconnect with them and their ease in the environment. Okay, so what's the conventional wisdom or response? There's a movement of support by law schools and law firms to make first-generational lawyers more comfortable. But here's another theme that in the literature that I object to, and is that can we expect big law firms to make a big difference to a significant number of first-generational lawyers, or in the legal profession in general? A lot of literature looks to big law as a metric of success, or looks to big law as the savior, entities with unlimited funds to right a lot of wrongs or to make significant differences overall. And I question that, and we'll get into that deeper in the later slides. Here's a theme in the literature that I'm on the fence with, and the theme is that pressure for law school ranking hurts women. And at first blush, I thought this was junk science, but I read the article a couple of times and got out my calculator, and it's in the middle ground. There could be some validity here in my humble analysis and opinion. And in brief summary here, there's a premise that women score 2 points lower on LSATs. Now that premise I have trouble with, because when I was in law school, the women were just as smart as the men. Everyone had great LSAT scores. And in a personal experience, I'm unaware of how you'd even measure to say that a random group of men and women are going to have a meaningful variation in LSAT scores. But that's the premise of this article, of this book. So I'm thinking, well, I'll suspend my disbelief. I know there is a lot of controversy on bias and test taking, but if we can just suspend our disbelief that 2 points would make a difference, if we can just sit with that for a while, then the next premise is that law schools want to boost their school rank, and they do that by having a high median LSAT acceptance rate. Now that makes sense to me because I know the fight for law school ranking is vicious. Law schools do all sorts of things to try to boost their ranking in the various venues where that happens. They think they're going to get more donations, and it's very, very competitive. I mean, law school in general it's a competitive bunch, and the law schools are there as well. So this makes sense, and this is a theory that I'm going to say I'm on the fence in, and it could well be the case here. Also, a lower LSAT score would mean less financial aid available, which means less access to top-tier law schools. So that would explain, if we're going to have our conventional metrics of, making partner in a big law firm equates success. If women do score a little bit less in the LSAT, they're going to have less money available to go to these expensive law schools, and hence just not have the representation in the quote upper echelons as we've defined them. And again, I do believe that these law schools do care about rankings, maybe arguably more than anything else. So that's my cynical view on that. Now, here's an article that was a real eye-opener for me. It's by Beth Robinson. It was published October 24th, 2017, just a few months ago. The importance of diversity and opportunity in the current political climate. And what it says is that in certain professions like law and medicine seem to be immune to diversity efforts, and that only 5% of lawyers and doctors are Black. But here's the broader statement that's troubling but worth addressing and getting out on the table here. And this lady writes that boardrooms remain persistently lacking in diversity, and the problem doesn't stop there. It says, in general, no well-paying industry looks like the general public for gender or race. Let's say that again. In general, no well-paying industry looks like the general public for gender or race. When I read this, I was just shocked. And I thought, well, do I believe that or not? I don't know. I'm still sitting with it. I haven't done an empirical study, but this raises a real important issue of why has there been ink spilled over the last several decades about diversity in the law with no great help? Back when I went to law school, about half the class was women back then, and that's still the case, but yet we still have these various perceived problems. So maybe there is an overall problem in our society having to do with bias, implicit, explicit bias. Maybe there's social economic terms here that are so huge that they permeate our entire country. So no wonder we're having problems here. And how can we expect a few big law firms to throw a few dollars here and fix this? So this is something that's troublesome, but it's an issue that we need to keep in the front of our minds, that maybe we're arranging deck chairs on the Titanic while the whole ship goes down, if this whole country has a problem, and that no well-paying industry looks like the general public for gender or race. It's going to be a problem that we have to address on a much broader issue. So how do we address diversity in the law? Well, at least two steps, maybe earlier steps going to socioeconomic status. I remember when I was in college, the professor would say, well, it's going to be hard for some of you to get into Harvard because you didn't go to the right prep schools, et cetera. I mean, maybe it starts from before you're born. But let's keep this on a more realistic level. The first step to be a lawyer is you have to get into law school. And there are many scholarships and loans available, and there are many clubs and support groups are found at law schools for people of diverse backgrounds. So that is there, but that's been there for 30 years. I recall seeing that when I went to law school. So maybe that isn't enough. The next element is diversity in our profession is making a living as a lawyer. If you're going to be a lawyer, you need to support yourself as a lawyer. So it's a basic question, but let's look at the numbers and where we might be on that. Again, I keep going back to big law because many of the articles that I read as the metric of success, how many lawyers work at the big law firms, how many make partner. But let's step back and look at the reality. My humble understanding is that maybe less than 1% of law school grads are going to get a job at big law. Most lawyers work for themselves or for mid-sized firms. So making a living as a lawyer, working at big law is just the tip of the very iceberg of it, and is not really indicative of an overall percentage of people making a living as a lawyer. So then how else do we do this? Well, small firms. And in our local Marin County Bar Association, we have an initiative to get a diverse background in our legal profession here. But here in this county, we don't have large firms. The largest firms maybe have 15 people in them, and many of us are with very small firms. And the question is, how does one gain access to a small law firm? And the other issue is, how would you get to Marin County where the housing prices are very high? And the answer is you have to, it's with someone who you know. It's through networking, which is an issue that we're going to hit in other slides here. And then the other issue that comes up is, if you're going to be a solo practitioner out of law school, it's very difficult because you'll have no experience and no clients. So these are issues that pertain to all law students getting out of law school. How do you make a living as a lawyer? And I can see the argument that for people of diverse backgrounds, it's even more difficult. So no wonder we don't have a diverse lawyer workforce in a lot of counties such as Marin County. And the other issue that comes up, and I think this is important, is can local bar associations help out? And I think they can. I think there's a lot of things that can be done at sort of the grassroots level to help obtain diversity in the legal profession. And it's a great bigger multiplier than, again, relying on big law or relying on presentations by CLE or state bar committees that talk about things, but nothing really changes. I think that work at the local bar level could be a national paradigm shift for diversity in the legal professional. Say that again. I think that more work at the local bar association level is where we want to go. It's the national paradigm shift for diversity in the legal profession, because where else is it going to happen? It's got to happen lawyer by lawyer, town by town, county by county. I think that's an answer here that we haven't seen in the literature. All right, covering the basis for D&I, and that's a new term to me. When I studied for this, I understand that means diversity and inclusion. And after I put these slides together, I thought about the term inclusion, and I like it. It makes sense because we support diversity, but also inclusion for everyone here. So that allows everyone to put in their 2 cents as to what can be done to help everyone here. And as I mentioned before, the literature on achieving diversity in the law goes back for decades. If you Google the subject, read up, there's some older articles all about it. And so this is not a new interest, but again, there hasn't been a lot of great strides made on how we define great strides. So what's wrong? What are we looking at incorrectly? What are some new ideas to make this work? And the big one that I think I have is at the local bar level. We can do a lot of things to help out person by person in a meaningful way by networking, mentoring, um, interviews to get things going here at the grassroots level where you actually meet people who you might be able to help. So also in the current literature, there's no great process in the field, progress in the field using the current metrics. So I'm going to question, how do we measure success? The current literature really offers no silver bullet systems, and this could be a nationwide challenge reaching all professions, as we talked about earlier from the slide that said everywhere in the country, the good paying jobs don't reflect the nation as far as sex and ethnicity. New York has a diversity and inclusion office, they call it D&I. And from the New York State Bar website, it talks about D&I programs, and this will qualify as one of the D&I CLE programs. And what do they want to see? They want to hear about implicit and explicit bias. And the last 20 slides here talk about bias. We may not get to them all, but I wholeheartedly agree that it's all about implicit and explicit bias. And then there's equal access to justice, serving a diverse population, diversity and inclusion initiatives in the legal profession, and sensitivity to cultural and other differences when interacting with others. So I have some slides on that at the end in my bias section. So I think this New York State Inclusion Office actually has this very correct. It's about bias, having equal access to the resources, and then some cultural sensitivity. So this seems right on point, and these slides and these presentation dovetail with that rubric. The only difference is I question a lot of the premises in the conventional wisdom. Now here's a real important issue that I'm going to talk about over and over in this presentation are the categories of diversity. And here we have our standard categories: race, ethnicity, national origin, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, religion, age, or disability. We're going to expand upon that definition of diversity, so it becomes pretty all-encompassing. And I'll do a spoiler alert. It's going to include anything that inhibits your ability to practice law or to be effective. So it's broad-ranging, and that broader definition makes sense to me. In fact, my favorite quote here is from Matt White, our past president of our Marin County Bar Association. And I did email him last night. He gave me authority to quote him on this, is that a broader, more sustainable, meaningful definition of diversity is anything that causes difficulty or is an impediment in practicing law or interacting with others. Hopefully I've done justice to that quote. So it's anything that makes your life difficult. And it's going to include age, mobility challenges, but also the new thing here is a lack of computer skills. And I think there's a bit of ageism here, saying that older people can't master computers. And my mother, into her 80s, she was texting people. She mastered it well. It just took somebody to sit with her and show her the ropes. So there's a little bit of ageism here, saying that the older people can't master computer skills. But I think that is, the digital divide is a category of diversity. Those who are on the wrong side of the digital divide are going to have problems making it as a lawyer, getting into college, getting into law school. So I'm including digital skills, the digital divide, in our definition of diverse groups. Illinois, one of the two current states having a diversity requirement. I went to their website, dug around. I didn't find a whole lot as to what are the necessary elements, but they do require a 1-hour lecture of diversity and inclusion. One of my favorite terms here in this presentation, inclusion. And it says the requirement can be met by mentoring, which makes perfect sense, because the theme that I have is that an effective tool for success for any lawyer or anybody in any profession is Mentoring, back in my day, it was never heard of. It'd be considered a sign of weakness to go ask for help from some experienced person on how to do things. Little did I know that would have been a great help to my career. But inclusion and mentoring. So a theme here is we're going to talk a lot about mentoring. And again, that's often implemented at the local state bar level. From what I read and in my own experience of being part of the Marin County diversity section, mentoring and networking seem to be an answer. That just makes sense. People get initiated. The more people you know, the easier it is to get a job. So what does the data show about success of the conventional wisdom and how we're measuring success? I'm going to quote here: while women and minorities are going to law school in greater numbers, they are not reaching the top. So the written work in the field does not offer a clear or agreed upon solution. But the mentoring and networking groups seem to be in vogue, and this makes sense. They help first-generation lawyers get used to the environment, and it provides a great support system. And our local bar association has run this program success, and also it's good for breaking the ice, and it's good for inclusion, one of my favorite themes here. So mixers, getting together, inclusion. I remember back in the day when I went to law school, the different law firms would come in, they'd have the wine and cheese, and we'd talk and we'd be together. And I think it really helped people sort of get used to one another. And at the bar association, we'll meet up at a restaurant and talk and break bread together face to face. A lot of what we're missing in our society is this face to face interaction. I think the face to face interaction helps with inclusion, helps with networking, and there's something relevant. It's not on the slides. There's a great HBO special now put together by Carl Reiner, where he interviews his fellow colleagues who are all 90 and over. And one of the themes for a long and productive life is face-to-face interaction. We're social animals. And this gets into our tribal instincts later that we'll talk about in the area of bias. So since we're social animals, we live longer if we're social face-to-face, not FaceTime or Facebook, but in person. It's better for everybody. So as much as I hate getting out of my office, as much as I dislike driving places, there is a value to meeting face to face. And that is a great tool in this goal to increase diversity in the legal profession. So again, the literature has a perceived failure. We're not going to solve this issue soon. But the good news is that from what I can tell, the challenge of inclusion seems to be less formidable. Life is getting to be a more friendly feed experience. That's one of my favorite phrases. My daughter, Rachel, learned this in one of her team sports. As you know, when a ball is given to somebody, it's to be mostly a friendly feed, unlike my day in high school sports, where it was very competitive and vindictive and not a friendly feed. So I think the world is getting a bit softer and more tolerant. My best anti-example of inclusion is a classic law firm softball games. I've been with a couple of big firms, and they have the softball game, and it was about exclusion because, of course, only a few people are going to be good softball players. The rest of us are out in the field for about 10 minutes, and it turns out we have trouble throwing or hitting a ball. We're lawyers. We don't do this. And so we feel excluded watching others. So this is the worst form of, I think, law firm bonding, team building, inclusion are these competitive softball games. Hopefully they aren't there anymore. My recommendation for inclusion is for bar associations, networking groups, and law firms is to pick events that are doable for all. And again, these are going to be the mixtures of water and cheese, or doing some team building sports where everyone is on equal footing, because with the softball game, nobody's equal, and it just leads to disaster and alienation. So let's talk about, is our definition of reaching the top to be reconsidered? Because again, what we're doing, what's going on, doesn't seem to be working. So let's relook at the problem here. And only, the literature talks about only a very small percentage of lawyers work in large firms. Making partner in a large firm is often used as a metric of success for a member of a diverse group. In all the literature that I've read, they all talk about big law and how many partners of ethnicity do they have, what are the percentages, who's on the hiring committee. It's all about big law in the articles. And I think that's just wrong. Because again, big law hires less than 1% of all lawyers. And while I agree that everyone should have an equal chance if you want to go work for a big law firm and punish yourself with unrealistic billing requirements, but so I digress. Not many partners at big firms, in my opinion, seem to be having a good time. That's just my personal observation. So I question this metric, and I submit that while we all should have equal access to go get abused at a big firm, we got to look at other metrics of success if we're really going to study this really interesting issue. And that's why I found this article by Colleen Elephant to be really interesting. She wrote this article. So why doesn't the legal profession view women-owned solo and small law firms as relevant to diversity? And what she talks about here is that if you look at female-owned businesses, small law firms owned by women, either small or solo, they've increased 2.5 times the national average and at a rate 4.5 times higher than all firms. So I think this lady has the right idea. Why do we ignore women who are starting their own firms and doing well and measuring success? Because to me, and I'll get on this in the later slides, if you're great at your job, you do good work, odds are you're going to be financially successful. And while maybe there are impediments at larger firms from all kinds of inertia and weird things going on there, where most of us are free to open up our own shop and be successful if we can deliver. And this article says women are, and they are just killing it. And so I would submit, if we look at articles like this, maybe on certain levels, we are becoming more diverse. And if you're to believe this article, which I do, women are doing better than ever. We just have to think about how do we measure the metrics? How do we measure success? I think the big law firms, again, we're obsessed with that. Who knows what's going to happen there? But on the more local scale, women are doing very well with their own law firm. So that's an important thing to think about. So it goes to how do we measure success? Now, the New York bar, Illinois bar talk about bias, and it's an important concept that we're going to talk about later in the later slides. We may not get to them based on the 1 hour time constraint here, but I've written a lot about it. It's one of my favorite subjects to talk about, but it seems to be relevant, and it could explain the earlier article that we looked at. It says, in all professions, the people who make the money don't reflect the composition of society at large. So what could be some of the culprits? Bias comes in there, and it also permeates into the concept of first generational lawyers having cultural and confidence bias, and also deals with test bias, the LSAT bias of women not doing so well or doing just slightly lower. To backtrack a bit, that article talks about just 2 points lower, making a minute difference, but these minute differences seem to add up to be rather harsh on women. So maybe an answer is to make the test have less gender bias if that's possible. So bias, I have a proposed big picture view of this, and has to do with, what are the systemic problems with bias? How can we deal with it, and what causes it? So the first part of this inquiry to me is to figure out, are we biased, and if so, why? What are some of the believable answers as to bias? I believe that in general, educated people want to do good. They want to do the right things. They don't mean to have bias, but why is it that maybe all of us have a certain bias. Why could that be? Well, there's been a lot of great studies on that revolving group theory. And we're going to talk about a couple studies that talk about that and a few experiments that have happened that you probably know about. And a lot of these studies have been done in the protected classes that we have here. And some of the studies have been done in truly arbitrary classes such as blue team, red team, to further emphasize that we are group animals, we're pack animals. We evolved in a tribe, a small group of people protecting each other. And so it's not far-fetched to think that we do have sort of an inherent bias that could be just even embedded in our DNA. But the good news is we can get through that and get over that if we put a little effort and become aware. And I think that's an answer to diversity, is education and thought in the general population of our society. So why do we care about reducing bias? Well, it's in our enlightened self-interest as owners of law firms, as owners of business, and to the members of the legal profession. We want to know that if we're mindful of factors beyond the protected classifications, it's going to help our business, and we should discuss real-world examples of successful bias diffusion, as I call it. So let's start from the very beginning. What is bias? What is prejudice? Bias, I'm going to submit, is to have a preference, sort of a biasing of a scale for certain things. The first one here is, would you rather eat some dog food or an apple? Okay, based on how a lot of people eat today, I'm thinking dog food might win, but let's hope we're all healthy here. And the apple is looking better to you to eat. So that's sort of a visceral, from the heart, from the gut bias or preference. I'm looking at this dog food, I'm looking at the apple, I'm getting sick to my stomach looking at this dog food. I do not want to eat that, but the apple looks pretty good right now in the afternoon. So that hits our gut. That kind of goes to our DNA. You can even talk about Pavlov's dogs here, but we won't go there, of bias. It's a preference for one thing over another, is one definition. And then of relevance here, we have mechanical bias, spring gadgets here, like this one here. This really interesting patent here has a mechanical arm, has springs on it. So if it's moved one way, it wants to urge in a certain way. And I think as human beings, we all kind of want to urge in a certain way here. So we have mechanical bias as well, which is, to me, is relevant. And then we have group bias, an attraction or lean toward members of one's own perceived group, a distrust for members of another group, and this gets into stereotypes. And I suggest that today we're going to study this in a factual and unemotional manner, such as the spring bias in a mechanical arm. Let's do that. Let's go ahead and be bold here and just look at this. So what is discrimination? Sort of a close cousin of bias here. So here we're saying, would you rather have Trader Joe's $2 chuck or one of my favorite wines is Freemark Abbey wine? I'm looking at the Freemark Abbey out of Napa. And so I remember in college, I took a great class from a guy named Professor Ed Bronson. He said, is it bad to discriminate? And he said, no, because discrimination means that you have careful taste, that you've judged, and you're going to have the nice red wine over the $2 chuck. So discrimination in and of itself isn't bad. What's bad or evil is to make a choice without tasting, without the study of things, which kind of gets back into bias. So what are the definitions of discriminating? To have a perception of events, to have excellent taste or judgment, a discriminating interior designer, possessing distinctive features capable of differentiating and being discriminative. So I want to take that word apart. I was shocked for that in college, but it's worth talking about here to get to the root of this. So discriminating taste, This looks pretty good. The sage roasted peanut butter squash and cedar soup, a great recipe from Whole Foods. I recommend this. This is really great here because I've tried it and I have discriminating tastes. I'm going to eat that over the dog food here. Now, but can we judge tequila by its price or age? This gets into bias here. So I'm looking at some Anejo Patron versus maybe some Silver Patron, and the natural bias is, oh, the Anejo is better. But some of the tequila I found is the Silver Grand Patron. It's $200 a bottle. But if you just judge it from its color here, you wouldn't know that it is the best stuff around. So this gets into getting beyond our known stereotypes and really studying the particular objects. And then, but we all want to keep an open mind, because as I tell my daughters, if Costco doesn't have it, we don't need it. So here's some Costco Anejo tequila that's really good at $20 a bottle. So here again, we've really got to study the objects to figure out what we like and what we don't. And this seems to make sense because, as Nelson Mandela states, we got to conquer our fear of the unknown and study things. And also, I really like his quote of, do we learn to hate? And the human heart is full of joy. And if we just can get over that and think about it, the human spirit is the opposite of hatred. So I sincerely believe that. And let's figure out, how do we get to this place of initial hate? Now, I know some of my lectures talk about this too often, but I'm a big fan of studying evolution. I'm a big fan of Darwin. I'm a big fan of what I consider the fact is we've evolved over millions of years. And it's only in the last 10,000 that we've adapted this sort of wheat diet, this industrial age of farming, which has caused all kinds of problems to our bodies, to our psyches, to group theory. On the other hand, there's no going back, and we're not going to have our NFL football games. We're not going to be able to eat Doritos and do all these great things that we love to do, sit around and do nothing all day, arguably, or have leisure if we go back to our pre-industrial past. So we're stuck with it, but it's important to realize that our bodies, minds, and psyches really haven't evolved in the last 10,000 years. We evolved over millions of years to be hunter-gatherers. So how is that relevant? Well, out in the field, you're with your group, I'll call them a tribe, and you see someone of another tribe. They may look different, maybe same skin color, but they may have different markings, different grooming. Who knows what was going on millions of years ago? But for survival in the group, you needed to make a quick decision, friend or foe. And probably people who survived, who lived to reproduce. I think Darwin's about reproduction of the fittest, not necessarily always just survival of the fittest. But if you had this, if you were bred to be suspicious of those in the other group, maybe you'd live longer because life was very raw, very competitive. Millions of years ago. And so those who developed a fear of heights probably passed their genes on. Those who developed or had the genetic propensity to fear those in another group probably passed their DNA along. So that's the baggage we're left with today, which doesn't help us one bit. And we have this fight or flight cortisol issue. When we get stressed out, we get cortisol and we get fat. And many of us older lawyers have horrific health problems from too much sitting from this DNA. So the relevance here on diversity is we evolved with a lot of baggage that helped us for over the millions of years, but not over the last 10,000. So it's important that we look at our roots and we not ignore Darwin. Now, if you want to ignore Darwin, you do so at your own risk. If you don't want to believe in science, I'm not going to help you here today on this. So why did we evolve this? There were a lot of efficiencies of being in a group, hunting, gathering, child rearing, companionship, emotional support, difficult to survive alone in the Stone Age. We have evolved into social animals. No person is an island. But we can think about that and take advantage here, because maybe that goes into the advantage of networking groups, social groups, mentoring, where you're meeting people face to face, and you get back into your tribe, your group, your support group. So maybe in certain levels we can embrace this human condition of wanting to be with others, because those who do well are interactive with others. Study of group data. We all learn sort of an us versus them hostility. People have been placed into various groups, whether it's the red group or the blue group, and soon people have a bias against those in a different group, and the differences can be very trivial. One of my favorites is the Robbers Cave experience done in 1954, where there are probably fewer regulations on human testing. This one person took 22 12-year-old boys to a state park in Oklahoma, randomly selected, and they were in one group, the other group, and they very quickly developed severe prejudice and hostilities intergroup. Nothing to do with race or how they looked. It's just our human condition, or arguably, I believe it myself, but you want to believe is you can figure out, draw your own conclusion. It just makes sense that we're pack animals, and we're going to have these natural bias for those in our group versus those out our group. So to me, an answer is to expand our groups through networking, socializing, getting out there and meeting various people. And then we have to ask, is group theory supported by current events? Over the last 100 years, which is really just not even a drop in the bucket for the existence of mankind, there's been over 200 million people have been killed over political events such as war or genocide. We seem to have never-ending warfare between groups or people. That seems really relevant to me. We're here today to try to figure out, how do we get a more diverse legal workforce? Nothing seems to work. So I'm suggesting we redefine the problem and step back and look at our civilization over the last 100 years. It's been an utter disaster. So is it realistic that we're going to quickly make significant improvements with diversity in the legal profession? I think it's going to be the big picture of humanity here. So are we surprised that we have some in the in-group and out-group conflict in our legal profession? So we want to consider group traits in the reduction of bias. Since group members may be selected by a flip of a coin, we're going to develop the group problem. And so this gets into the rules of professional conduct in one state. Unlawful and unlawful discrimination is by reference to an applicable state or federal decisions making unlawful discrimination in the employment or offering goods and services to the public. A very broad definition of what is prohibited discriminatory conduct. I think we need to get back down to the roots of it and the bigger group theory than these very narrow prohibitions that we find in our various states. So the protected classes are just a start of this. As we talked about, we should consider expanding protected classes. And then here's one, is a protected class or is an attribute wealth? And a lot of ink's been written saying, well, yes, if you come from a wealthy family, you're going to have more advantages. I think that's a factor that comes into play. What we can do about it, how do we level the field, that's beyond the scope here, but I'm just trying to keep it real here and look at the bigger issues that could be at play. We've talked about expanding the definition of the protected groups. Some of them could even be thinking style, speed of learning, and comprehension. There's an article that I read in preparation for this that talked about in interviewing women to adapt to their style of communication. Now, I was kind of offended because I don't find women to have that different style of communications. To me, that seems like a sexist article. But what do I know? Maybe the article's correct. So maybe methods of interviewing need to adapt, and maybe thinking style, emotional intelligence needs to go into a definition of diversity as well. So are we allowed to judge or discern, but to judge with knowledge of the individual? The short answer is yes, and it's an enlightened best interest to do so, because those who hire the best qualified, in theory, are going to make the most money. In college, I really enjoyed my macro and microeconomic classes. I talked about in his book, Wealth of Nations. And in theory, that does seem to work most of the time if you have equal access to the markets and equal access to information, and you have information. That's why the framers of the Constitution were big on a First Amendment. But I can tell you firsthand, it doesn't always work, that we don't have a level playing field. We don't have perfect information. And also we have something called separation between ownership and management in various economic systems. For example, our federal government has a great division between ownership and management. Large corporations, and the larger an organization becomes, the more inefficient it becomes, whether it's a government. So my quick story about going to get served in a restaurant in Oakland. I went to this restaurant in a certain ethnic neighborhood in Oakland, and me and my family, we weren't served. And we were able to sort of observe and be somewhat amused by it, thinking you're not going to get my money today. But that was a good example of why Adam Smith's invisible hand theory doesn't always work, just as arguably our free market economy arguably doesn't always work, because perhaps we don't always have the necessary groundwork of it, of perfect information, equal opportunity to markets, and the other premises there. So that's maybe beyond the scope of diversity, but it's important to ponder why maybe best qualified aren't hired, and there is improper, unlawful discrimination, unlawful bias against those of interviewing who are on a different group of somehow than the interviewer. So that's an explanation that is not going to be popular, but could in fact be the reality of why arguably not much progress has been made in achieving diversity in our legal workforce. So how do we reduce this insidious bias that's slowing down a lot of groups? Well, we unite groups in a common goal or common identity. I'm a big fan of team building exercises, not involving softball, of course, but rope courses look really interesting. Other things that bring people together on an equal footing. And because this human condition is difficult to stop for Mideast politics, they'll have children of the different warring factions go to a summer camp together. 60 Minutes did a story on this. And after a few weeks, everybody gets along. And that might be a good tool. I don't know how we implement it for diversity in the legal field, but that seems to work in getting rid of the institutional bias between different groups. Direct meetings between groups may not work well. In all meetings between groups, all the group members must feel equal. And so this is a good transition to the issue of what individuals can do to reduce bias. What can we do at the local level today, tomorrow, and get off of these high platitudes of, yes, there's bias, and aren't we doomed? How do we make everyone feel equal in our personal lives? Well, here's one of my favorite examples. We should be mindful of the subject matter of our small talk. One of my favorite stories is there's once a judge, doesn't matter where, well, in San Francisco, who was having a settlement conference, and he talked about one of the judges, one of the litigants wanted to talk about sports or fishing, and one of the litigants was attorneys was a male, the other was female, and the judge said, no, we're not going to talk about fishing or sports. He knew that would be polarizing. That would make someone who may not know, or the stereotype, not know a lot about sports or fishing, feel on an unequal basis. So in our own lives, we can be mindful of the subject matter of our talk. Whether it's talking about problems with your fancy car, maybe it's more interesting to talk about current events. That seems to be equally accessible to everyone. And of course, talking about religion and politics is not going to help in this quest to make everyone feel equal. So in our small talk, in our introductions, talking about common events is going to help in avoiding subjects that are going to be polarizing or be the basis for sort of a class stratification or a sexist stratification, talking about maybe activities that either men or women tend to do more than the other group. So we need to be mindful of vicious or small talks with twists of one-upsmanship. And speaking of others, let's keep our hobbies, possessions, and first world problems out of the mix. And one of the favorite examples I remember on this is when a director of a private school talks about, yeah, here we have diversity. We have both violinists and cellists. That sort of talk really exemplified an issue here of what do we talk about, what comes out of our mouth in not polarizing others. So when we talk to others, beware of sports. Let's stick to business. Current events are going to make everyone feel on equal terming. The other way we get rid of or deal with bias and making everyone feel comfortable in a group and trying to get rid of or ameliorate group theory, group bias, is to make people feel welcome in a meeting. And my favorite book on this subject is by Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. I think it's been in print for over 70 years. And in speaking to others, think about the other person. What is meaningful to them? Get yourself out of your own snooty, self-centered shoes and think about the you viewpoint. What is going to be meaningful to them? And if we all did this, people would feel more comfortable with us, and it would go a long ways to getting rid of the group theory, the group bias, and putting us all in a sort of a common group in this meeting. This is something that we can all start doing today. So a careful connection with individuals is a great way to reduce bias. Bias in action. Hopefully none of us in deposition will ask a female for a copy of the transcript. One of my favorite stories is in IP law firms not inviting the patent writers, that would be me, to a party, but instead of inviting the patent litigators because they're more lively, more aggressive, more fun. So invite everybody to your parties, be inclusive. This is starting to happen at the grade school level. I understand a lot of little grade school, the 1st through 5th grade, they'll have what's known as a buddy bench, where if a little kid doesn't have a friend, you sit on the buddy bench and somebody else will come by and grab the kid and go play. We never had that in my day 50 years ago. So I think the world is getting a little friendlier. Also, bias in action. Think about this. At some large firms, various associates are encouraged to serve on the diversity committee and thus lose billable hours. So if you're of a diverse ethnicity or one of the protected classes or who knows, and you say, hey, come join the committee, but you can't really bill those hours. Sure, you get to bill them to admin. Is that a problem? But who dares complain? So I ponder every action, there's a reaction. It's just something to ponder and to think about. So can we learn to withhold judgment? And one of my favorite law professors said this, Paul Persons, actually, from my undergrad. He said, there are very few emergencies in the legal field. Thus, in my humble opinion, we have time to study and think before making decisions. And that's especially true when hiring people, when interviewing people, and just in our, more importantly, our interactions in our legal community, because a lot of literature talks about a diverse starting class in a law firm, but how does the diverse body interact? How do they move up the food chain? And I think those ensconced in the organization can realize there's very few emergencies in their profession, and they can take time to study and think before making decisions, and hopefully avert this gut reaction that's not favorable based upon our DNA and group theory. So yes, we can learn to withhold judgment if we just think and show a little discipline in that regard. So I suggest we question everything, whether we're talking about bias or diversity, and we think about the bigger issues involved, and that diversity and bias problems have been a taboo subject. And I'm glad that the state of Illinois and New York are making this a mandatory subject, diversity inclusion, so that we do study it. I'm sure people watching this presentation are hopefully going to disagree with me, do some studies, and come up maybe with a counter presentation with different ideas than I've presented. And that would be great, because that would start the thought. That would start the dialogue, because until now it's been a sort of a taboo subject of why is this not working, and are we measuring correctly, and what can we do? And has bias been reduced over the past 5 years? I don't think so. But if we had a spring failure in a mechanical arm, where you're trying to bias a mechanical arm with a spring, would you hesitate to investigate? No, you take that arm apart, you dissect it to the nth degree, you put it in your CAD drawings, you do a finite analysis of it, and hopefully this presentation has encouraged everyone here to question everything on this subject, because it's a new subject for us. Just 2 states have this. Other states are going to follow. So this is a great field for all of us to study and to ponder. So I look forward to getting emails. What's fun for me is I get a surprisingly large number of emails from people who watch these classes with their points of view, and I answer every one of them. And so I look forward to your email saying, Steve, I think you missed the boat here. Whatever your truth is, I look forward to your feedback. And I want to thank you for sitting through this. And I certainly hope that I've started an internal dialogue within yourselves and an external examination within your various organizations. Thank you much.